Julian Voss did not like birthdays. He liked pianos. He liked the particular click of a tuning hammer settling against a pin, the smell of old felt and older wood, the way a broken instrument could be coaxed back into something that remembered how to sing. He liked quiet Tuesdays. He did not like birthdays, and he especially did not like the kind his best friend Priya insisted on throwing every year in the back garden of her bookshop, string lights included, whether he wanted them or not. "You say that every year," Priya said, balancing a cake box on one hip while she unlocked the garden gate with the other hand. "And every year you come anyway. I come because you'd break in and redecorate my workshop if I didn't." "I would," she agreed. "Happy birthday, by the way. You're 34 now. Ancient." The garden behind Windward Books smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Julian counted the guests as they arrived. 12, which was already 11 more than he would have chosen, and found a corner near the old fig tree where he could watch the gate without being watched himself. It was a habit from before. He didn't examine it too closely anymore. He noticed the stranger before anyone introduced him. The man was leaning against the fence at the far edge of the garden, half in shadow, holding a glass of lemonade he wasn't drinking. Dark hair pushed back like he'd forgotten to comb it on purpose. A jacket too warm for the evening, sleeves pushed to the elbow, revealing a forearm with the ghost of an old burned scar. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't trying to. He was watching Julian. Not in the way people watched the birthday boy, politely waiting for a good moment to say something kind. He was watching the way you watch something you already know the ending of. Julian looked away first. That too was a habit. "Who's that?" he asked Priya when she passed with a tray of glasses. She followed his glance. "Oh, Theo. Friend of a friend. He's staying in town for work. Something with the old lighthouse restoration out on Cutter's Point. I ran into him at the hardware store and he seemed lonely, so I invited him. Hope that's all right. It's your garden. It's your birthday. It's your garden," Julian said again, and Priya laughed and moved on, and the stranger by the fence kept not drinking his lemonade. It happened during the cake. Someone had lit the candles wrong. Too many, all 34 crowded onto a cake meant for maybe 20, and the flames were dangerously close to setting the whole thing on fire before anyone could sing. Julian stood there with his hands in his pockets, doing the thing he always did at this part of the evening, which was disappear a little behind his own face, smile in the correct places, wait for it to be over. "Make a wish," Priya said. Julian looked down at 34 small fires and thought, as he thought every year, that he didn't have one. Not the kind you could compress into a breath. He blew out the candles anyway. Everyone clapped. Someone put a slice on a paper plate and pressed it into his hands, and he was still holding it, untouched, when the stranger from the fence appeared beside him with the quiet suddenness of someone who'd been planning the approach for a while. "You always do that," Theo said. Julian blinked. "Do what?" "Blow them all out in one breath, but you never actually close your eyes first. You look at the flames the whole time, like you're daring the wish not to work." It was such a small, strange, specific thing to say that for a moment Julian thought he'd misheard. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" "No," Theo said. Something crossed his face, quick and complicated, gone before Julian could name it. "Sorry. That was strange of me to say." "It was. You also bite the inside of your left cheek when you're being polite to someone you don't like," Theo added, and then looked immediately, genuinely horrified with himself, like the sentence had escaped before he could stop it. Sorry. I don't know why I said that either. I should go." He went, not dramatically, just turned and walked back toward the fence, back toward the shadow, leaving Julian standing by the cake with a piece he didn't want and a strange cold feeling starting somewhere under his ribs. He had been biting the inside of his cheek. He hadn't realized anyone could tell. Julian found him again an hour later, out past the fig tree where the garden gave way to the alley behind the bookshop, streetlight buzzing orange overhead. Theo was sitting on an upturned crate, elbows on his knees, looking at nothing. "You're going to tell me how you know that," Julian said. Not a question. Theo didn't look up right away. "You won't believe me if I tell you now. Try me. You'll think I'm—" He stopped, exhaled, finally met Julian's eyes. Up close, in the bad light, Julian could see he was older than he'd first thought. Late 30s, maybe. tired in a way that had settled into the bones of his face rather than sitting on the surface of it. You'll think I've been following you. I haven't. I want you to know that first, before I say anything else. I've never followed you. I didn't even know your last name until Priya said it tonight. That's not reassuring, it's just specific. A small, unwilling smile. Fair. So how, then? Theo looked down at the lemonade glass he was still, somehow carrying, still full condensation running down onto his fingers. I knew someone once who talked about you. A lot. For years. Who? It's complicated. Try the simple version. There isn't one. Theo set the glass down on the ground beside the crate, carefully, like it mattered where it landed. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come tonight. I told Priya I'd stay 20 minutes and I've been here 2 hours because I kept telling myself I'd leave after I finally introduced myself, and then I didn't, and then you were standing there with all those stupid candles and I wasn't ready. I'm still not ready. I don't think I ever fully decided to be. Julian stood very still. Somewhere behind him, through the fence, he could hear the party continuing without him. Laughter, someone's phone playing music too loud, the ordinary noise of people who did not know that the ground under this particular corner of the evening had just tilted. Ready for what? He said quietly. Theo looked up at him for a long moment. Whatever he saw in Julian's face made something in his own face soften, then almost break. Not tonight, he said. I'm sorry. Not like this. You should go back to your party. It's your birthday. And infuriatingly, unbearably, he meant it as kindness. Julian could tell, even through the anger starting to climb up his throat, that the refusal wasn't cruelty. It was the opposite. It was a man trying very hard not to hand someone a wound on the one night a year meant to be theirs. I'll find you, Julian said. Cutter's Point isn't big. I'll find you. I know, Theo said. I'm counting on it. Julian did not, in fact, wait long. He gave it 3 days, 3 days of turning the strange encounter over in his hands like a piece of warped wood, trying to find the grain of it, before he drove the coastal road out to Cutter's Point, where the old lighthouse stood decommissioned and half-scaffolded against the gray afternoon sky, and found Theo up a ladder with a paintbrush and a look of profound concentration on his face. You said you'd find me, Theo said, not turning around. You found me. You knew I was coming? I heard the truck. A beat. Also, I've been half expecting you for 3 days. Every car on this road, I thought, that's him. Julian crossed his arms, stayed at the base of the ladder. I want the whole story. Not the complicated version you used to avoid things. The real one. Theo climbed down. Up close, in daylight, he had white paint on his knuckles and a smear of it along his jaw, and something in Julian's chest did an unhelpful, traitorous thing at the sight of it, which he chose to ignore in favor of being furious. Okay, Theo said. Okay, can we sit first? This isn't a 5-minute story. They sat on the low stone wall that ringed the lighthouse, facing the water. It was cold enough that Julian could see his own breath, and Theo, without seeming to think about it, shrugged out of his paint-flecked jacket and held it toward him. Julian looked at the jacket, looked at Theo. I'm not cold. You're doing the thing with your arms, Theo said, where you cross them because you're cold but you'd rather freeze than admit it. How do you? Julian stopped himself, pressed his palms against his knees instead, a small effort at composure. Just tell me. Theo set the jacket down between them, a compromise, and looked out at the water for a long moment before he spoke. I had a friend, he said, in university. My best friend, actually, the kind of friendship that reorganizes your whole life around it without asking permission. His name was Elias. Something in Julian went very quiet and very cold, colder than the wind coming off the water. He talked about his brother constantly. Theo went on, not yet looking at Julian like he needed the water to say it to instead. His twin. He used to tell stories about him the way other people quote scripture. Like there was a version of every life lesson that started with my brother used to say, or you should meet my brother. He'd hate you at first and then he'd love you more than anyone. He talked about the piano thing, the cheek-biting thing, the way you look at candles instead of closing your eyes. I heard about you for 6 years before I ever laid eyes on you, and somewhere in there you stopped being his brother in my head and started being, he stopped, swallowed. You started being someone I thought about too, which was its own complicated problem because I was in love with Elias and had been since the 2nd year of university, and had never once told him because he was straight and oblivious and mine to love quietly from exactly the correct distance. And you were the one thing in his life I couldn't share space with. You were his, not mine to want to know. Julian's mouth had gone dry. Theo turned to look at him then, and Julian watched the answer arrive on his face before it arrived in words. Watched 5 years of something terrible settle behind Theo's eyes. He died, Theo said. 5 years ago. I think you know exactly when. Julian did know exactly when. He had known the date so precisely, for so long, that hearing it confirmed by a stranger felt like being struck by something he'd built himself and forgotten was dangerous. You knew my brother, he said very carefully, like each word might detonate if handled wrong. You knew Elias. I loved Elias, Theo said, for 6 years. And I never told him, and then he was gone, and the only person left who understood exactly what that felt like was you. Except you didn't know I existed, and I didn't have the courage to walk up to a grieving stranger and say hello. I'm the man who loved your brother in secret, may I share your grief with you? So I didn't. I disappeared instead. I've been disappearing for 5 years. Cutter's Point is the 11th town I've worked in since he died. The water moved against the rocks below them. Patient. Indifferent. Why now, Julian said. Why here? Why my birthday? Theo let out a breath that shook slightly on the way out. Because I'm tired of running away from the only person on earth who might actually understand what he was to me. And because he stopped himself. Because what? Because I have something of his, Theo said, that I've been carrying for 5 years and don't know how to stop carrying. And I think it belongs to you, not me. And I think I've been too much of a coward to hand it over because the second I do, I don't get to hold on to him through it anymore. It becomes yours. And then I have nothing left of him at all. It took another week before Theo brought it. A plain wooden box, the corners softened with handling, tied shut with a length of fishing twine because the original clasp had broken years ago and he'd never fixed it, he said, because fixing it had felt like admitting the box was meant to be opened. They sat at Julian's kitchen table, the piano workshop humming quietly on the other side of the wall, 6 instruments in various states of repair standing patient in the dim light like a room full of held breath. He started them the year we graduated, Theo said, not touching the box, hands flat on the table on either side of it like he needed the wood to anchor him. Letters. Recordings, some of them on those little handheld tape things he loved because he said phones made everything sound too clean. He said his voice caught. He pushed through it. He said he was worried about you, that you kept everyone at arm's length, even him sometimes, and he didn't know what would happen to you if something happened to him first. So he started writing to whoever you'd eventually let get close, not knowing who that would be. Not knowing if it would ever be anyone. He gave the box to me a year before the accident and said, if you ever meet someone who's about to fall in love with my brother, give them this. They'll need it more than he'll ever admit. Julian's hands were shaking. He put them in his lap where Theo couldn't see. He thought you'd fall for someone, Theo said, quiet now, almost apologetic. He never once thought it might be me. Neither did I, Julian said, until about 4 days ago. Something passed between them across the table. Not quite a smile, not quite anything with a name yet, but warmer than the room had any right to be. Julian opened the box. Inside, 17 envelopes, none of them sealed, all of them addressed in Elias's slanted, hurried handwriting to whoever you are. A handful of cassette tapes, hand-labeled with dates. A photograph, curling at the corners of 2 boys. One grinning wide at the camera. One looking sideways at his brother instead of the lens. Half a smile, guarded even then. Julian picked up the closest envelope. His name wasn't on it. No name was on it. Just in his brother's handwriting. For whoever's patient enough to love him properly. He didn't open it that night. He held it instead, for a long time, while Theo sat across from him and didn't fill the silence with anything, because some silences, he seemed to understand, were not his to interrupt. Over the following weeks, Julian read them one at a time, slowly, the way you're supposed to take medicine you're afraid of. He learned, in his brother's restless handwriting, about a version of himself Elias had clearly loved with a fierce and slightly exasperated tenderness. The boy who used to fall asleep under the piano during their mother's practice sessions, who flinched at fireworks because of a bonfire that got out of hand the summer they were 9, who counted things when he was anxious, who loved with his hands instead of his mouth because words had always felt like a language he'd learned a beat too late. He learned that Elias had worried about him leaving town for the coast, worried he'd disappear into work the way some people disappear into drink, worried that Julian would build himself a life so careful and so quiet that no one would ever get close enough to actually see him. Whoever you are, one letter red near the middle of the stack, he is going to test you without meaning to. He'll go quiet in the exact moment you need him loud. He'll apologize for things that aren't his fault and never apologize for the things that are. He'll love you completely and tell you almost none of it, and you will have to learn to hear the parts he doesn't say out loud, because he means every one of them. Julian read that one 3 times, then set it down and sat with his hands over his face for a long while. In the workshop, surrounded by pianos that had gone quiet and patient around him, as if they, too, were waiting to see what he'd do next. He didn't call Theo that night, but he thought about him, not as the keeper of the box anymore, not as the stranger who'd known too much, but as the last living person who had loved his brother, quietly, hopelessly, for 6 unspoken years, and had carried that love all the way to Julian's doorstep because he hadn't known where else to put it down. They began meeting without quite deciding to. Theo would knock on the workshop door on his way back from the lighthouse, paint still drying under his nails, and Julian would put down whatever instrument he was mid-repair on and make 2 cups of tea neither of them finished. They talked about Elias sometimes, carefully, in pieces, the way you'd handle something fragile that had already been broken once and glued back together imperfectly. Other times they didn't talk about him at all, and those evenings had their own particular grace, both of them learning what it felt like to sit in a room with each other and simply exist, unhaunted, for an hour. Julian noticed things. He noticed that Theo hummed under his breath when he was concentrating, off-key and unaware of it. He noticed that Theo always left space on the workshop bench for Julian's tools, even before Julian reached for them, as if some part of him had already learned the shape of the room Julian needed around him. He noticed that Theo's hands, when they weren't painting or fidgeting or holding something to keep them busy, had a habit of going still and open on the table, like an invitation nobody was supposed to notice him extending. One evening, fixing a warped soundboard together, Theo holding the clamp steady while Julian worked the glue into the seam. Their hands brushed, and neither of them moved away. "I keep thinking," Theo said very quietly, eyes on the wood instead of on Julian, "that this is the strangest possible way for 2 people to fall for each other. Through a dead man's letters. In his brother's workshop. I keep waiting for it to feel wrong." "Does it?" "No," Theo said. "That's the part that scares me." Julian set down the glue brush, looked at him properly, for the first time in weeks without the shield of a shared task between them. "He wanted this," Julian said. "Not you and me specifically, he couldn't have known that. But he wanted someone patient enough to love me properly. Maybe he didn't get to pick who, but I don't think he'd hate that it turned out to be the person who loved him first." Theo's breath went unsteady. "I never told him. I know. I think about that every day. That I had 6 years and I never said it once." "He knew," Julian said, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "I found a letter, the one dated a few months before the accident. He didn't write your name, but he wrote about a friend who loved him and never said so, and how he wished that friend would stop being so careful, because careful had never once made anybody less afraid. It had only made them lonelier while they waited to stop being scared." Theo made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, somewhere in between, raw at the edges. "He knew," he repeated like it needed saying twice to become real. "He knew," Julian said again, gently, "and I think if he could see this, you, me, this ridiculous room full of broken pianos, I think he'd say we both learned his lesson about 7 years too late, and he'd never let either of us forget it." That startled a real laugh out of Theo, wet and surprised, and it was in the middle of that laugh, unguarded and unrehearsed, that Julian leaned across the workbench and kissed him. Not because a story required it, but because there was, in that specific unrepeatable moment, absolutely nowhere else in the world either of them wanted to be. It should have been simple after that. It wasn't. 3 weeks into whatever they had become, not quite named, both of them too careful with words to rush the naming of it. Julian woke in the night to find the other side of his bed empty and Theo sitting on the back step in the dark, the wooden box open on his knees, the last unread letter in his hands. "You haven't opened that one," Julian said, sitting down beside him, careful, still half asleep. I know. Why not? Theo turned it over in his hands without opening it. In the moonlight, Julian could see his jaw working, the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to come apart. Because it's the last one, he said. And once it's read, there isn't anything else. No more of his handwriting I haven't seen. No more of his voice I haven't heard. This is it. The last piece of him that still exists that I haven't used up yet. And his voice cracked clean in half. I don't know how to let him be finished, Julian. I've spent 5 years measuring my life by how much of him I still had left to find. And after this, there's nothing left to find. He's just gone. Actually, finally gone. Julian didn't reach for the letter. He reached for Theo's hand instead, and held it, and let the silence do what silence does best, which is simply exist alongside a person until they're ready to move again. You don't have to open it tonight, he said finally. I think I have to open it eventually. Eventually isn't tonight. Theo looked at him then, eyes wet, something fragile and grateful crossing his face. You're doing the thing he wrote about. Hearing what I'm not saying. I'm learning, Julian said. I had a good teacher. 2 of them, actually. They sat like that a long time, hands joined, the unopened letter resting closed on Theo's knee, and the ocean somewhere beyond the dark rooftops making its slow, patient sound, indifferent to grief, indifferent to love, simply continuing, the way oceans do. Theo opened it 2 months later, not alone and not in the dark, but on a bright windless morning at Cutter's Point, sitting on the low stone wall with Julian beside him and the newly restored lighthouse standing finished and gleaming white against the sky behind them. Its light due to be switched on again for the first time in a decade that very evening. The letter was short, shorter than the others. Elias's handwriting, near the end of it, had gone looser, less careful, like he'd written it fast, in one sitting, afraid of losing his nerve. Whoever you are, it began like all the others. But then, differently. If you're reading this last one, it means you made it all the way through, which means you're either very patient or you love him more than you know what to do with. Probably both. I want to tell you something I never told the person I should have told. I loved someone once and never said it, because I thought there'd be time. Because there's always time until suddenly there isn't. Don't do what I did. If there's a version of you reading this who's been careful the way I was careful, stop. Say it. Say it badly if you have to. Say it at the wrong moment, at the wrong volume, with your voice shaking. It will still be better than never saying it at all. Take care of my brother. He is going to try to talk you out of loving him at least once, probably more than once, because some part of him will always believe that people who get too close to him eventually leave, and he has never once been given a good enough reason to unlearn that. Don't let him talk you out of it. Stay anyway. Prove the old belief wrong, one Tuesday at a time, for as long as it takes. And if the person reading this is you, the one I think it might be, the one I never had the courage to say this to directly, then I already know I picked right because you're the most patient person I've ever known, and my brother needs exactly that, and I need you to know that I loved you too the whole time in the space I never let either of us look at directly. I'm glad it's you. I hope it's you. Take care of him. Take care of each other. Theo read it twice before he could speak. When he finally looked up, his face was wet and unguarded and, for the first time since Julian had met him, entirely unafraid. He knew, he said again, quieter this time, not needing it confirmed anymore. He actually knew. Julian took the letter gently from his hands, folded it, and held it against his chest for a moment before tucking it back into the box with the others. The last piece of his brother's voice, finally, fully spent, finally allowed to rest. Come on, he said, standing, offering his hand. You've got a lighthouse to finish. They switched it on together that evening at dusk, the 2 of them standing at the base of the tower while the new lamp inside spun to life for the first time in 11 years and threw its long white arm out across the darkening water, sweeping the coastline, finding the rocks, finding the boats coming home, finding everything it was built to find. I used to think, Theo said, watching the light turn, Julian's hand warm in his, that I'd spend the rest of my life being the person who carried Elias's box around and never opened it. That the box was the only thing keeping him alive, so I had to keep carrying it forever, or he'd really finally be gone. And now I think, Theo said slowly, working the thought out as he spoke it, that maybe he's not in the box at all. Maybe he never was. Maybe he's in the version of you who stopped counting things when you're anxious. Maybe he's in the fact that I finally said something instead of disappearing into the 12th town. Maybe he's just here, in this, not because we're carrying him, because we let him go, and it turns out that's what he wanted the whole time. Julian didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. He leaned into Theo's shoulder, the two of them watching the beam sweep the dark water, around and around, patient and constant, the way some things, once properly lit, simply keep turning, long after the person who built them is gone, casting their light forward for whoever comes looking for it next. Behind them, in the workshop across town, 17 empty envelopes sat folded in their wooden box on a shelf between two half-restored pianos. No longer a burden either of them had to carry alone. Just a story, finally finished, exactly the way it was always supposed to end. Not with a wedding, not with a proposal, not with any of the things a lesser story might have reached for out of habit. Just two men, on a cliff, in the dark, watching a light they'd fixed together finally do the only thing a lighthouse has ever been built to do. Turn toward whoever's still out there, and welcome them home.